All right, so is Kirby Smart a hero or a villain? This is something that Ari Wasserman was writing about, and I do want to talk about this just for a second. It's kind of a curious way of putting it because I think Nick Saban was always kind of considered a villain, generally speaking, and Jim Harbaugh. But I think one thing that villains often have lately in common is they're good. Um, that's not what's happening here necessarily. Let me read what he had to say, and I'll take it from there. He's got the villains as Deion Sanders, who I think is every. I mean, people wouldn't stop watching him. So I mean, and then Lincoln Riley, who has a real set of haters out there. Dabo, who I think is just getting on people's nerves at this stage. And then those are the three villains he's got. He's got Kirby Smart as a hero, which I will talk about in a second. Lane Kiffin is a hero. I don't know about that part. And then Dan Lanning, he calls Dan Lanning a hero too. Um, I think Dion is definitely a villain. I'm not sure I subscribe to that, but he is viewed that way for sure. He is also viewed. So that's the part I think people need to keep in mind is that, you know, people care about watching. He is Ric Flair. I mean, if you don't know who Ric Flair is, I mean, I don't know how to say anything about that, but um, I think people want to watch Dion lose. I think that's a lot of what it is. In this past season, that there was a lot of that going on at Colorado. We'll see if that continues. Lincoln Riley and Dabo are both, for me, a little bit. They're not winning in ways that matter. So I think that's what is conducive to being a villain. When you think about someone being a villain, usually they're diabolical. I mean, Steve Spurrier, I think for a lot of people was a villain, not just in Athens. Nick Saban, trying to think, Jimmy Johnson, if you remember back in the day with the Hurricanes. There have been villains. I don't know that former USC coach Pete. Oh my gosh, I can't believe I've forgotten his name. I don't think everybody thought about him as a villain necessarily, but Mac Brown I don't think was like really a villain. But Lincoln Riley has rubbed people the wrong way. I think mainly because of the way that he left Oklahoma. Let me come back to those coaches first. Here's what he has to say about Kirby. You'd think that he would wind up on the villains list, given that he's leading America, the most dominant country program in the country. People are probably already experiencing Georgia fatigue as the Dogs try to win a third national title in 4 years. But consider this. When was the last time Kirby had a controversial public opinion or comment? When was the last time he interjected himself into someone else's business? Smart is about his own business and he takes care of it. He hasn't done that publicly. Um, I don't think people realize how intelligent Kirby Smart is out there in the world. He is extremely smart. Um, extremely. He is not a typical college football coach like so many of them are. I mean, there are a lot of just sort of nitwits and not very bright people, and that is good and bad for Kirby. I think that mainly is good, but I think that there's some bad associated with it too, in terms of being extremely smart. Talking about here's another part from that, saying when was what was the part? Um, for the most part, the only hatred Georgia seems to get is from rival schools, fans, people resentful of its success. It doesn't seem like there are random Miami or Washington fans who just despise Smart and Georgia. That's because they've not won enough, long enough. But that will happen, and um, I think for me over time, I think Kirby's already done a better job at Georgia than Steve Spurrier did in his time at Florida. Um, Spurrier had a harder job at Florida. Okay, let's be clear about that. What Kirby was taking over was a consistent 10-win program that was consistently in the top 20, if not top 15. Okay, that was not what happened the moment that he got hired, but that was basically what the run for 15 years was under Mark Richt. That was not what Steve Spurrier got at Florida. He got a team on probation. He, it was just not it was not good. Spurrier had to go further than Kirby, but Spurrier was viewed as a villain. I think that that's not the case because Kirby doesn't. I just he's not viewed that way yet. He's not viewed as evil. I think a lot of people viewed Spurrier that way. I think a lot of people viewed Nick Saban that way. I'm not old enough to be and to intelligently speak about how really Vince or Bear Bryant were viewed, but you give it some time and Kirby will be viewed as a villain. I think it's only a matter of time, but I do think that this writer's point is not wrong about. I mean, no one thought of Dan Mullen as being a villain, just kind of weird and kooky. I think Dabo being viewed as a villain. No one hates the Padres. Like, no one cares about the San Diego Padres. No one thinks about them. No one thinks about the Carolina Panthers. We're getting close to that point with what is going on at Clemson right now. That's what I would be concerned about if I were their leadership over there is, we've had we won 2 national championships in a matter of 3 years. It was an amazing run. And we played for national championships, and we did this and we did that. And, if you look at the history of Clemson, it ain't that. It's mainly about an 8-4 team or a 7-5. Good years were 9-3. I think they went from 1992 until 2013 without a 10-win season. Something like that. So, they just weren't good. And I'd be worried that that's what we're getting close to because our head coach isn't taking it seriously like he used to. I don't know. I think there's cause for concern. As it relates to Lincoln Riley being a villain, I think people just love to hate on the guy because they didn't like Caleb Williams. They didn't like the way that he left Oklahoma. They didn't like that he took Caleb Williams with him. They didn't like that Caleb Williams had stuff on his fingernails. And, I think Lincoln Riley won a lot in the Big 12 with OU and never did anything when it came to big games. I mean, I don't know how else to put it. I mean, when you think about, speaking of Clemson, they took them out in the semifinals. Georgia took them out in the semifinals. LSU broke their brains in the semifinals. Those were all with Lincoln Riley teams that, honestly, Oklahoma shouldn't have been in that semifinal in 19. They were not one of the top 4 teams in the country. Georgia lost to LSU, and they didn't want to put Georgia back in there. That's what that was. So that happens. I can't remember the 18. I don't remember what happened with Lincoln Riley in 18, but I think you just got to give it a little time in terms of. I think personally that James Franklin is a villain, but I don't think he's important enough to really talk about. And I don't know why Ryan Day is not a villain necessarily either. I think when you're fighting with Lou Holtz, I mean, let that guy go away, man. Lou Holtz is old and irrelevant. I mean, he just doesn't matter. I do think Dan Lanning is someone people like. I mean, just as a person, and then what really fired people up about Dan was, what he said about Colorado before that game and how they were going to whip their ass, and basically, rooted in substance, not flash. Today we talk with our pads and the top of your helmet. The Cinderella story is over, and they're fighting for clicks. We're fighting for wins. He got that from that came from himself, but he saw that with Kirby and them. Kirby, that's the way Kirby talks to his team. I think the thing about it's hard to the 2 guys here that are on as villains, specifically Lincoln Riley, and I don't think Deion's fake. I think the thing with Dabo and Lincoln Riley is there is a someone's like, this is not quite authentic. Like, something's missing here. I don't think people feel like that with Kirby. I don't think they think he's not authentic. I think that there are issues with him. They are not that he's not authentic. If you are caught being not yourself, or overly like the Dabo thing with paying players. I mean, we're years into paying players, and he said he'd leave. He's still around. So if people feel like you're not being honest about the situation you're in, or all of that, they will ding you. And I think in this case, there's reason to do so. There's not as many villains in college football, just thinking about it, as I feel like there once was. I mean, you don't have Bobby Bowden and Steve Spurrier. You don't have, you know, Nick Saban's not around. I don't think that Les Miles was ever a villain necessarily. Um, we've had some change in college football lately. I mean, you don't. I mean, Clemson's not where they've been. Maybe they will be if they shock Georgia and Atlanta this week. This September. Ryan Day's not gotten a national championship yet. There's any discussion of Lane Kiffin has to be mixed in with the guy's never won his league, and I don't think ever in any league, but certainly not in the SEC. When you start thinking about a guy got fired on the tarmac, that's tough. That's tough going. Certainly a comeback coach of the year, but we don't have Jim Harbaugh, who I think people kind of were annoyed by. We don't have a lot of the coaches that have been around. They've lost their luster a little bit, and particularly with Nick gone, now Harbaugh's gone. The only guy hanging around that's won a national championship lately, there's only two of them. It's Dabo and Kirby, and Dabo looks like he's on the back end of this thing. So there will be new villains. There's just not as many of them right now. I mean, you can't call Shane Beamer a villain, right? I mean, you gotta matter more. I think Josh Heupel and OU have got like a thing. Is Brent Venables a villain? I don't find him that way. Is Steve Sarkisian? I think people want Steve Sarkisian to continue to do well because of all the things he's overcome. People at Oklahoma don't, but I think nationally Kirby's not viewed as a villain for some of the reasons that were explained in the story, that opinion piece from Ari Weisselman. But if this happens a couple more times, people are going to get tired of it. I can assure you of that. People did it. I remember very clearly. I'll tell you who it was. It was David Ching. David Ching, I said, Alabama, something about Alabama. He said, you wait. He said, you watch them win and you see what that's like. Because honestly, my adult life, Alabama had never really won. They won the national championship in 92, but that's somewhat, I mean, does anyone even think about Michigan winning a national championship these days? Like, it's kind of like it happened and it just was like, nobody's thinking about it down here. And he said, when Alabama is good, there's nothing like that. And he had kind of lived it a little bit. And he's right. And now that's gone. I mean, Nick's gone. Florida's not a power. LSU is sort of still figuring things out. There's so much transition at coaching these days. We don't have, there was a time when we had Urban Meyer, Nick Saban, Mark Richt, Les Miles, Steve Spurrier. These people were all in the same league. They all could win the national championship or did at the schools. So it was just a different moment in time. And we're not there right now. And I don't know if maybe it's that when Texas comes in, they will become a villain. I don't know. I will just see. But I thought it was a very curious to take that the guy who has won most recently of anyone else in college football right now, he's not a villain. I don't know what that means. You tell me.